They said I was 74 and lucky to have a place like Golden Pines, but every time the nurses called me Grandma instead of my name, I felt myself disappear a little more. I had given my whole life to raising my son after his father died, believing he would one day stand by me the way I once stood by him. Instead, I overheard him and his wife plotting to take the inheritance my sister left me and send me away to a state-run home, as if my years meant nothing. That night, with tears on my face and my dignity burning inside me, I chose silence over confrontation. I slipped out into the darkness with my suitcase and whispered to myself, "This life is still mine to protect." The hallway of Golden Pines smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you'd walked through it. My slippers shuffled against the linoleum as I made my way back from the dining room. They'd served oatmeal again. They always served oatmeal. I told the aide at the door I wasn't hungry, but she just smiled and called me Grandma, like she always did, as if I didn't have a name or a past. I was just another old woman in a beige sweater, easy to lump together with all the rest. My name is Margaret Collins. For 35 years, I stood in front of classrooms full of restless teenagers, chalk dust on my skirt, explaining algebra with a firm voice. Back then, people called me Mrs. Collins or Ms. Maggie if they were bold. I had authority. Here in this place with pastel walls and the hum of fluorescent lights, I was Grandma. It was like the years of my life. My marriage, my career raising my son. All of it had been erased. They saw gray hair, wrinkled hands, and nothing else. I passed a nurse with a clipboard. "Good morning, Grandma," she said in a sing-song voice, eyes already moving on to the next resident. "It's Margaret," I muttered, but she didn't hear, or maybe she didn't care. I kept walking, clutching my cardigan tighter around me. Back in my room, I sank into the armchair by the window. The October sky over Rehoboth Beach was the color of steel clouds sagging low with rain. Drops tapped against the glass, distorting the view of the parking lot, where a few cars sat under the drizzle. I'd always loved autumn when I lived in our old colonial house, the one with the wide porch and the maple tree that flamed red every October. I could almost hear David raking leaves while I stirred a pot of stew inside. That house was sold 6 years ago after he died. Too big, too empty, too full of ghosts. On the dresser sat a framed photograph of him taken in 2016, a year before pancreatic cancer stole him from me. David looked so alive in that picture, smiling under the sun at Bethany Beach, a beer in his hand. His eyes followed me no matter where I stood in the room. I touched the frame with my fingertips. "You were lucky," I whispered. You didn't have to end up here. You didn't have to see what's become of our boy." My throat tightened as I thought of Ethan. He used to come every Saturday walking in with a bag of groceries or a box of chocolates with almonds because he remembered they were my favorite. He'd sit on the edge of the bed and talk about work, about his plans with Vanessa. Back then I felt like I still mattered, but then Saturdays turned into once a month, then once every few months. Now it was mostly phone calls. Short ones, too. "Sorry, Mom, I'm in a meeting. I'll call you back." But the call back rarely came. I had become an item on his checklist. Flowers on Mother's Day, a courier-delivered gift on my birthday, one quick phone call for Christmas. Check, check, check. The radiator hissed to life, a sound I had come to depend on in the silence. I leaned back and closed my eyes, remembering nights when Ethan was a boy. I'd sit at the kitchen table grading papers while he built Lego towers on the floor. He'd ask me to check if they were straight enough, and I would laugh and tell him, "Use the ruler, you're an engineer already." David would come home late from his shift at the plant, kiss me on the forehead, then scoop Ethan up even if he was covered in chalk dust from my skirt or grime from his toys. We were a family. We were whole. A knock at the door broke my thoughts. "Mrs. Collins!" "You didn't come down for breakfast," a young nurse said, peeking her head in. Her ponytail was messy, her sneakers squeaked. She held her clipboard like a shield. "I wasn't hungry," I said without turning around. "At my age, I've earned the right to skip oatmeal if I want." She smiled nervously. "All right, but I'll mark you down. Lunch at noon." I'll be there. I answered, though my voice was flat. She nodded and disappeared, leaving behind the faint scent of berry gum. I sighed and pushed myself up to stand in front of the dresser. Alongside David's photo were older ones, Ethan at his high school graduation cap, slightly crooked, Ethan and Vanessa on their wedding day. Her smile stretched wide, his nervous grin betraying both excitement and fear. I studied those faces like clues in a puzzle. Where had the boy gone who once begged me to stay up late and watch the stars? Where was the man who promised me he'd always visit? I pulled a wool shawl around my shoulders and sat on the bed. The rain outside grew heavier, streaking the window in silver lines. Golden Pines tried to mask the scent of disinfectant with lavender oil diffusers, but it only made the air thick and artificial. Some days I felt invisible even here where the staff had my name on every chart and schedule. But I wasn't invisible to myself. I carried decades of memories of battles fought and won, of lessons taught, of love given freely. It was just that no one seemed to care anymore. I turned back to David's photo, the smile frozen in time. "You were spared this," I said softly. "You never had to sit in this beige room waiting for the phone to ring, hoping your son remembers you're still here." My eyes burned, but no tears came. I'd cried enough already. Instead, I sat still listening to the rain, feeling the weight of silence pressing against the walls. And in that silence, one thought settled heavy in my chest. Maybe being forgotten by the world was worse than death itself. I closed my eyes, clutched the shawl tighter, and let the memory of my husband's voice carry me into the waiting hours until lunch. A knock came at my door just after 10, firm and purposeful, not the tentative tap of an aide. I opened it to find a woman in a dark navy suit standing there, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She introduced herself quickly. "Mrs. Collins, I'm Jennifer Walsh, an attorney from Wilmington. May I come in?" Something in her tone made me step aside without hesitation. She walked in, setting the portfolio on the small table by the window. Her hair was neatly pinned back, and her expression was serious but not unkind. I sat opposite her, my hands folded tight in my lap. "I'm here regarding your sister Alice Turner," she began. The name alone made my stomach clench. Alice? My older sister. We hadn't spoken in nearly 2 decades, our last argument over our parents' estate, cutting so deep that neither of us had found the will to bridge the gap. Jennifer's eyes softened. "I'm very sorry to tell you that Alice passed away in March of this year. Lung cancer. It progressed very quickly." I blinked, the words falling over me like stones. Alice. Gone. For a moment I could almost see her as she had been at 20, striding ahead of me down the boardwalk in Ocean City. Always bossy, always sure of herself. Stubborn, proud, brilliant. And now just gone. I pressed my palms together. She didn't tell me, I whispered. She never called. "She asked that you not be informed," Jennifer said gently. "She didn't want you to see her that way, but she did make changes to her will the week before she died. That's why I'm here." From her portfolio, she drew out a sealed envelope and a cashier's check, sliding them across the table. My breath caught as I saw the figure, $325,000 issued by First National Bank, tied to a safety deposit box in my name. "This is yours," Jennifer explained. She was very clear. The funds were withdrawn and secured in this form per her request. There are also instructions for a safe deposit box in Wilmington. The key is in the envelope. My hands trembled as I picked up the envelope, the familiar loops of Alice's handwriting scrawled across the front. "For Margaret." My throat closed. I hadn't seen her script in years, yet it was instantly recognizable. I broke the seal slowly, almost afraid the words would cut me open. Inside was a single page written in her sharp, tidy hand. "Dear Maggie, if you are reading this, it means I've already gone. I suppose it's fitting. I always needed the last word. We wasted 20 years on bitterness, and looking back from the end, I see how foolish that was. What's a grandfather's watch or a mother's quilt compared to decades of silence? I can't change the past, but I can leave you something that might give you freedom. I saved all my life for a future that never arrived. Don't make the same mistake. Live while you can. Forgive me or don't. But know that I thought of you until the end. Your sister Alice." The words blurred as tears welled in my eyes. I hadn't cried in years, not like this. Loud, racking sobs shook me, the kind that left my chest aching. I pressed the letter to my heart, rocking back and forth as if I were holding on to her one last time. When the tears finally subsided, anger crept in. 20 years lost. 20 Christmases without a card. 20 summers without a phone call. And yet here was her voice in my hands, too late, too final. Jennifer waited quietly until I managed to look up. She slid more papers across the table. Documents I needed to sign to acknowledge receipt. My hand shook as I wrote my name, aware of the curious eyes of an aide passing in the hallway. She slowed as though craning to see what business a lawyer had with me, but quickly moved on when Jennifer shut the door. When the attorney gathered her things, she paused. "Mrs. Collins, if you need assistance managing the funds or setting up accounts, please don't hesitate to call my office. Alice wanted you to have control, no one else." I nodded mutely, still clutching the letter. She left me with the check, the envelope, and the sudden weight of a future I hadn't imagined. Alone again, I laid everything out on the bedspread, the check gleaming with its impossible sum, the brass key taped inside the envelope, the letter folded carefully. My mind spun. $325,000. More money than I had ever touched in my life. It could pay for years at Golden Pines, or buy me a place of my own, or secure comforts I had long given up dreaming about. But more than the money, it was Alice's words echoing in my head, "Live while you can." I looked at David's photo on the dresser, his steady smile holding me up even now. "What do I do with this?" I whispered. "How do I keep it safe? How do I make it mean something?" The radiator hissed. The rain drummed steady on the window, and the air in my little room felt charged, alive, as though the walls themselves were listening. I gathered the check and the letter back into the envelope, hiding it deep inside my suitcase under folded sweaters. Then I sat down, hands clasped, heart hammering, and thought this could change everything. But not if Ethan or Vanessa ever found out. I closed the suitcase with a decisive snap and leaned back in my chair, staring at the rain-smeared glass. For the first time in years, possibility stretched before me, fragile and dangerous. And I knew I would have to guard it with everything I had. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I called a cab and gave the driver an address in Newark, Delaware, where Ethan and Vanessa had settled into their dream house years earlier. I didn't call ahead. I wanted to see their lives as they truly were, not the polished version they prepared when they knew I was coming. The ride took nearly an hour. I sat in the back seat with my suitcase pressed against my leg, the envelope hidden inside under sweaters. The check and the letter felt like burning coals against my skin, a secret too heavy to share. The driver hummed along to the radio, oblivious to the storm in my chest. When we turned onto Ethan's street, I pressed my hand against the window. It was one of those manicured developments where every house was built to look timeless. Colonial-style red brick with white columns, wide porches, shutters, painted hunter green. But Ethan's house betrayed something the others did not. The lawn was overgrown dandelions sprouting up like little flags of surrender. The hedges bulged unevenly, desperate for trimming. On the porch, a stack of unopened mail lay against the doorframe, soggy from recent rain. The cab rolled to a stop. I paid the fare and struggled with my suitcase. As I climbed the walkway, I caught sight of a yellow paper stuck to the door under the pile. I bent down and saw the seal of the Homeowners Association, an HOA violation notice, stern black letters demanding payment of overdue fees. My heart thumped. Ethan had always been careless, but not like this. The door opened before I could knock. Mom Ethan's voice was bright, a little too bright. He pulled me into a hug, but his eyes darted immediately to the suitcase at my side. "You should have told me you were coming. I would have picked you up. I wanted to surprise you," I said. Studying his face. He had dark circles under his eyes, a patch of stubble on his chin. At 42, he looked older than I remembered, shoulders tight under his dress shirt. He grabbed the suitcase with a grunt. "Goodness, Mom, what do you have in here?" "Bricks, books, shoes, things I can't do without," I replied lightly. My pulse quickened. I knew exactly what was inside, and I prayed he wouldn't guess. Vanessa appeared in the hallway, her heels clicking against the hardwood. She looked like she'd just stepped out of a glossy magazine. Tight navy dress layers of gold jewelry, nails perfectly painted. Her perfume filled the air, strong and cloying, the kind that lingered long after she passed. She smiled, but it was a smile that never touched her eyes. "Maggie," she said smoothly, leaning in to brush her cheek against mine. "What a lovely surprise. If I'd known you were coming, I would have had your room ready." "I'm sure I'll be comfortable anywhere," I said. Her grip on my arm was fleeting, more polite than warm. "Let's get you settled," Ethan interrupted quickly, leading the way upstairs. I followed him up the carpeted steps, my knees aching. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, but beneath it I caught something else. Stale air, as though rooms had been closed off too long. He opened the door to a guest bedroom. The bed was neatly made, a vase of artificial flowers on the dresser. No photographs, no signs of life. A room meant for temporary visitors. He set my suitcase down with a thud. "Here we are. You'll like the view of the backyard," I nodded, walking to the window. The garden below was patchy brown spots scattered across the grass. A broken swing sat lopsided under a tree. The neighbors' yards, by contrast, looked pristine. It was impossible not to notice the difference. "I'll let you freshen up," Ethan said quickly. "Dinner tonight. Vanessa ordered something nice." When he left, I sank onto the edge of the bed and exhaled the tension in my shoulders, unspooling slightly. I glanced at the suitcase, the hidden envelope nestled deep inside. He had looked at it too long, his eyes flickering with curiosity. I couldn't shake the feeling he already suspected something. Later, when I went downstairs, I caught sight of that yellow HOA notice again. It had been moved to the counter, folded hastily but not hidden. The words, "Final Warning," were printed across the top. My stomach clenched. Whatever front they were trying to maintain, the cracks were already visible. I slipped it back where I found it before anyone noticed my mind buzzing with unease. This was not the life Ethan and Vanessa had painted for me in their quick phone calls. Something was wrong here, and I could feel it pressing against the polished walls of this house like a secret trying to escape. That evening, the dining room looked like something out of a catalog, but I could tell most of it was staged. The long table was dressed with a white linen cloth, crystal goblets gleamed under the chandelier, and Vanessa had set out silver cutlery that looked far too polished to be used regularly. The smell of Italian takeout wafted up heavy with garlic and tomato sauce as she unboxed trays from a local restaurant and arranged them as if they were home-cooked. "Smells incredible, doesn't it?" Vanessa said, flashing her perfect teeth as she set down a platter of pasta. Her bracelets jingled as she moved the sound oddly loud in the quiet room. Ethan poured wine into my glass, just an inch or two. "Only a little, Mom." "You always said one sip helps the heart." He smiled, but his eyes flickered down at the table before settling back on me. I gave him a nod and lifted the glass. "Your father used to say that too. Not everything he claimed was scientifically sound, but it made him happy." We clinked glasses and began to eat. The food was good, but the silence between us was heavier than any meal. Ethan broke it first, launching into a story about work. "Things at the company have been rough," he said, twirling pasta around his fork. "The new development project is behind schedule and my bonus got pushed back again. But it's fine. I've got it under control." He said the last part with a forced certainty, the kind of phrase meant to convince himself as much as us. Vanessa cut in quickly, her tone bright. "And I've been working on a new client's home, a family in Greenville with a house worth over $2 million. They want a full redesign. Can you imagine it's going to be my breakthrough?" I chewed slowly, studying her face. Her eyes darted left when she spoke, and her fork barely touched her plate. I'd taught enough teenagers to recognize when someone was embellishing. "That sounds like a big opportunity," I said gently. She nodded too fast, sipping her wine. It is. Just a matter of time before I'm featured in one of those design magazines. The conversation drifted awkwardly after that, punctuated by the scrape of cutlery. I noticed Ethan eating quickly, his shoulders hunched while Vanessa barely touched her food, just pushing it around her plate. When the dessert came, tiramisu in glass dishes. Vanessa insisted on paying for the meal. She reached into her purse, pulling out a gleaming black credit card, and handed it to the delivery driver who was still waiting at the side door. Moments later, the man cleared his throat. "Ma'am, this one's been declined." The words hung in the air. Vanessa's face froze. Then she gave a laugh too high-pitched to sound natural. "Oh goodness, I must have given you the wrong card. Here, use this one." She snatched the card back, fumbling with her wallet before producing another. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The driver nodded, ran the second card, and left with a polite, "Have a nice evening." I kept my face neutral, but inside alarms were ringing. Vanessa's hands trembled slightly as she poured more wine into her glass. "These things happen," she said, waving it off. "Banks make mistakes all the time." "No harm done," Ethan added quickly, though his eyes didn't meet mine. I forced a smile and took another bite of dessert, letting the moment pass without comment. But my mind was working. The overgrown yard, the HOA noticed the stack of mail on the porch, and now this. The facade was cracking. After dinner, Ethan and Vanessa busied themselves clearing dishes. Mom relaxed in the living room. Ethan said, his voice a little too cheerful. "We'll take care of everything." I nodded and rose slowly, but instead of heading straight to the couch, I slipped into the kitchen under the pretense of washing my hands. They had their backs turned, whispering to each other as they stacked containers into the trash. On the counter by the microwave, half hidden under a magazine, lay a white envelope. I recognized the bold print immediately. Notice of default. My heart sank as I pulled it closer. The letter from the bank spelled it out. 3 weeks left before foreclosure proceedings would begin unless overdue payments were made. My breath caught. This wasn't just carelessness or a temporary setback. They were drowning. I tucked the letter back exactly where I found it, my fingers shaking. Then I returned to the living room and sank into the leather sofa, staring at the flickering light of the television they'd left on for noise. The laughter from the kitchen sounded rehearsed, brittle, like actors in a play pretending everything was fine. I folded my hands in my lap, the envelope in my suitcase weighing on me like lead. If Ethan and Vanessa ever found out about Alice's money, they wouldn't see it as a gift meant for me. They would see it as salvation for themselves. And sitting there in that polished house with its cracked foundation, I realized the secret I carried had just become even more dangerous. The house had gone still after 10. I lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling, the blue glow from a nightlight in the hallway seeping under the door. My throat was dry. Finally, I slid out of bed, slipped my feet into slippers, and opened the door as quietly as I could. The hallway creaked under my weight. I held my breath, clutching the banister as I made my way down. Halfway to the kitchen, a voice stopped me cold. Vanessa's low and urgent carrying through the thin wall that separated the dining room from the back hall. I froze in the shadows. "Please, you can't cut us off now," she hissed into her phone. We'll get caught up next month. We just need more time." There was silence, then her voice climbed, strained with panic. "I told you. We already have 3 loans out. There's nothing left to leverage." My chest tightened. I pressed myself closer to the wall, heart pounding in my ears. Through the crack of light under the dining room door, I saw her pacing, one hand pressed to her temple phone, clutched to her ear. A muffled male voice joined hers, weary and thin. "Ethan, she's right," he said. "We're tapped out, but if you can just give us a few more weeks." He stopped listening. His shoulders sagged, his head drooping forward. "Yes, I know what foreclosure means," he muttered. "I'm doing what I can." Vanessa's voice sharpened again. "Don't talk to him like that. Ethan's doing everything he can at work. The company owes him a bonus." It's just been delayed. Once that comes through, we'll make payments. You'll have your money." The silence that followed was broken only by her ragged sigh. She ended the call abruptly and tossed the phone onto the table, her bracelets clattering against the wood. I pressed a hand over my mouth, terrified the sound of my breathing would give me away. The floor beneath me felt unsteady, like I might fall through if I moved. Ethan sat down heavily at the table. His voice was a whisper, but in the hush of the house I heard every word. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Vanessa poured herself a splash of wine from an open bottle, her hand shaking slightly. "We'll figure something out. We have to." He didn't argue. That was what chilled me. He didn't remind her of the salary he earned or promise that the next paycheck would be enough. He just sat there, head in his hands, while she drank. I stepped back, slowly, careful not to let the stairs groan under my weight. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I forced myself to move like smoke. At the top of the stairs, I slipped into my room and closed the door with a click no louder than a breath. The suitcase sat at the foot of the bed. I dragged it closer, my fingers trembling as I unzipped the side pocket where the envelope was hidden. The cashier's check, the letter from Alice, the small stack of cash I had tucked away. They were still there. Relief washed over me, but it was bitter fleeting. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, clutching the suitcase to my chest like a life preserver. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might split my ribs. I'd known something was wrong from the moment I stepped onto their porch, but hearing it confirmed in their own voices was a different kind of wound. They weren't just careless. They were drowning. And now I understood why Vanessa's smile felt brittle, why Ethan's laugh seemed hollow, why the house looked grand from the street but tired and hollow inside. I rocked slightly, the suitcase pressed against me. In the quiet, with only the faint hum of the central air for company, I whispered to myself, "They can't know. Not about this. Not ever." The room tilted, my thoughts spiraling. 3 loans overdue payments, the HOA violation, the foreclosure notice in the kitchen. And now the desperate phone calls in the night. My worst fears had crystallized into truth. I leaned back against the headboard, staring into the darkness until my eyes burned. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even close my eyes. All I could do was sit in the shadows with my suitcase pressed against me, waiting for morning, wondering what else I would uncover if I kept my ears open. By mid-morning, the house had gone quiet, the kind of stillness that made every tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway echo like a drum. Ethan was shut away in his home office upstairs, his voice drifting now and then as he took conference calls. Vanessa had left in her SUV earlier, her heels clattering down the steps, her perfume hanging in the air long after the door closed. I wandered through the rooms on the first floor, moving slowly so the creaking boards wouldn't give me away. The living room looked staged, like no one really used it. Decorative pillows arranged perfectly, coffee table magazines with untouched spines. I drifted toward the back hallway, where double French doors led to what I remembered Ethan describing as Vanessa's studio. My hand lingered on the knob before I eased it open. The smell of strong candle wax hit me first, mixed with the faint metallic tang of printer ink. A wide white desk dominated the room, scattered with fabric swatches, glossy catalogs, and folders stacked in messy towers. At first glance, it looked like the space of someone busy and productive. But when I leaned closer, the truth lay bare. There were bills everywhere, open envelopes with red stamps reading "past due," credit card statements with balances in the tens of thousands, a letter from the HOA demanding immediate payment of accumulated fees, warning of legal action, and stacked off to one side, several letters from collection agencies, the bold font at the top of each page, unmistakable, final notice. My pulse thudded in my ears as I traced the figures with my finger. They weren't just behind, they were buried. I placed everything back exactly as I found it, afraid even the smallest shift would betray me. My stomach churned as I closed the doors softly and returned to the guest room, heart hammering. That evening after dinner, plates had been scraped clean and the wine bottle half drained. I excused myself early, feigning fatigue. Upstairs, I kept the lights low and sat near the vent in my room, the one that carried sound from the floor below. I had learned long ago as a mother that you can hear more in silence than you ever will by asking questions. Their voices rose through the vent, muffled but clear enough to follow. "She's been acting strange," Vanessa said, her words edged with suspicion, dragging that suitcase around, never leaving it open. "You saw the way she looked at the notice on the counter. She probably just doesn't want to interfere." Ethan answered, his tone weary. "She's always been private." There was a pause, then Vanessa's voice sharpened. "You need to talk to her. Convince her to sign over power of attorney. If she's got anything saved, we need access. It'll take the pressure off." I clutched the edge of the bed, bile rising in my throat. Ethan let out a long exhale. That's not something she'd ever do. "She might," Vanessa pressed. "You're her only son. She'd trust you if you framed it as helping her." "Think about it, Ethan. With POA, we could consolidate everything, negotiate with the banks, keep the house. Otherwise, we're out on the street in 3 weeks. The silence that followed was thick. Then Ethan spoke again, low and reluctant. "Even if she did agree, it wouldn't fix everything. We're too far behind. Then we cut expenses." Vanessa's voice dropped lower, icy. "She's paying for that nursing home in Rehoboth, isn't she? Golden Pines. That place isn't cheap. If we moved her into a Medicaid facility, we'd save thousands every month." My stomach clenched so hard I thought I might be sick. I pressed my hand against my chest as if I could hold my heart in place. Ethan's chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp through the vent. "That's my mother you're talking about. Don't be dramatic," Vanessa shot back. "She's 74. Realistically, how many years does she have left? 5-10 if she's lucky. That money should be used for us while it can still make a difference." The words rattled in my skull like stones in a jar. 5 years. 10 if I was lucky. As though my life could be measured and spent like the balance on one of their credit cards. I covered my mouth, trying to stifle the sob that threatened to break free. Ethan didn't argue, not really. I waited for him to raise his voice to defend me, to tell her she was cruel. Instead, after a long silence, I heard him mutter, "I'll talk to her tomorrow." The conversation drifted after that, their voices lowering until I could no longer make out the words. I sat frozen in the dim light of my room, the shadows stretching across the walls like prison bars. The suitcase sat at the foot of the bed, silent and accusing, as though it already knew what they wanted from me. I slid down to the floor, drawing my knees up to my chest. Their plan replayed over and over in my mind. The power of attorney, the Medicaid facility, the dismissal of my life as little more than a dwindling clock. Somewhere in the silence that followed, I made myself a promise. If they saw me only as a burden and a source of money, then they would never see the truth coming. I would not hand over my life or my freedom on their terms. Downstairs, laughter floated faintly brittle and rehearsed. Upstairs, I sat in the dark with my arms wrapped tight around myself and heard Vanessa's words echo again and again. 5 years, 10 if I was lucky. I sat on the edge of the bed, the shadows from the lamp stretching long across the guest room walls. My eyes stung, and before I could stop them, tears slid down my cheeks. It wasn't just what I had overheard. It was the ache of realizing how far Ethan had drifted from the boy I once held so close. I saw him as he had been at 15 when David died suddenly. My son's eyes were wide and wet, his voice cracking as he asked, "What happens now, Mom?" I had held him tight, swallowing my own grief, and promised I would take care of everything. I worked 2 jobs, skipped vacations, patched clothes instead of buying new ones, all to keep him steady on his feet. Now he was 42, and instead of protecting me, he was willing to let his wife discuss my life like it was a ledger to be balanced. I pulled the suitcase closer, unzipping it carefully. My fingers brushed against the envelope tucked deep under layers of folded sweaters. I pulled it out, opening the flap just enough to glimpse the cashier's check. $325,000, my sister's final word, my sister's redemption. I pressed it to my chest, then slid it into the inner pocket of my cardigan close to my heart. Next, I counted the bills I had withdrawn before coming here. $25,000 in neat stacks, crisp hundreds, still smelling faintly of the bank vault. I slipped the bundles into a smaller bag that could fit in my purse. The suitcase swallowed so much, but it suddenly felt heavy with meaning. I added my pill bottles labeled in neat pharmacy print blood pressure, cholesterol, something for the arthritis in my knees. I slipped my notebook inside as well, its pages filled with crossword puzzles and half-written letters never sent. I tucked in 2 changes of clothes and a shawl David had given me years ago, the wool worn soft at the edges. My hands trembled as I packed, but the more I moved, the more resolve replaced the grief. I couldn't confront them outright. If I told Ethan what I had heard, he would deny it. Vanessa would act offended, accuse me of misunderstanding. They'd smooth it over with smiles, and I would be the paranoid old woman they humored until they could press harder. No, I couldn't give them that chance. I zipped the suitcase slowly, the sound loud in the stillness. My pulse raced in time with the closing teeth of the zipper. I rose and looked out the window at the backyard. The garden was dark, the broken swing creaking faintly in the night wind. Beyond the neighbor's porch, lights glowed warm and steady lives moving forward in houses where people still spoke to each other with kindness. The clock on the nightstand ticked closer to midnight. My breath came steady now, my decision solidifying with each second. I would leave tonight. Not tomorrow, not after breakfast, not after another conversation that might trap me in their plans. Tonight, under the cover of dark, before they realized the depth of what I carried. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater and sat down again, this time calmer. I checked my purse, driver's license, health insurance card, bank card, cell phone with a charger. Everything was in place. My body still ached from arthritis, but I knew adrenaline would carry me down those stairs when the time came. I thought again of Alice's letter. Her words etched deep in me. Live while you can. She had been talking about freedom, about using what she saved to carve out the life she never dared to take. For me, those words became something sharper, a shield against the people who would take my years from me if I let them. In the silence of that room, I whispered to myself, "You can do this, Maggie. You've done harder things before." I thought of raising Ethan alone, of nights I stayed awake at his bedside when he was sick with pneumonia, praying he'd breathe easier. I had carried us both through darkness before. I could carry myself now. The house below had fallen still. No more clinking of glasses, no more murmured voices drifting through vents. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the settling wood. I placed my suitcase by the door and slipped under the covers, shoes still on cardigan buttoned. My body rested, but my mind remained sharp. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the steady tick of the clock. And when I closed my eyes, I wasn't imagining the house or the people below me. I was picturing the road out of Newark, the dawn breaking over Rehoboth Beach, the smell of salt in the air. My decision was made. By morning, I would not be here. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 12:17 when I finally eased myself out of bed. My shoes were already on. I had lain there waiting, heart-thudding, until the house had gone completely silent. I slipped the cardigan tighter around me, grabbed the suitcase, and opened the door a fraction. The hallway was dark. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft tick of the thermostat on the wall. At the top of the stairs, I paused. One wrong creak could rouse them. Slowly, I pressed my weight into the banister and took each step on the edge of the tread where I knew the wood might hold quieter. The suitcase wheels bumped lightly against the carpeted stairs, so I lifted it by the handle, my arms straining. At the bottom, the red glow of the home security panel blinked steadily. My stomach twisted. I remembered the code. Ethan's birthday, the same one he had used on our old colonial back in Wilmington when he was a teenager and thought he was clever. I pressed the buttons, each beep loud as a gunshot in the silence. The light turned green, the system disarmed. I exhaled slowly, a breath I didn't know I was holding. I reached for the door, careful with the latch. The hinges whispered as I pulled it open. A wash of night air hit me. Cool, damp, tinged with the faint smell of rain on asphalt. At the curb, headlights blinked once. The cab I'd ordered on my phone sat waiting, engine low. The driver's silhouette faint behind the wheel. I stepped quickly onto the porch suitcase, clutched tight, the boards groaning softly beneath me. Every sound made me flinch. I moved down the walkway faster than my knees liked the arthritis flaring with each step. My chest thudded with urgency, the thought of Ethan or Vanessa's face appearing in a window freezing me to the core. But no lights came on. No voices called after me. The house loomed behind me in silence, its windows black squares against the night sky. I slid into the back seat of the taxi, pulling the suitcase in after me. The driver glanced at me in the mirror but said nothing. I gave him the address of the bus station in Wilmington, my voice hushed as if the walls of the house could still hear me from the street. As we pulled away, I twisted in my seat to look back. The house stood shrouded in darkness. The porch light left off the only sound in my ears, the pounding of my own pulse. For a moment, I thought I heard the ticking of the grandfather clock inside, counting away the seconds of my departure. I turned forward again and gripped the suitcase so tightly my knuckles whitened. Inside, beneath sweaters and shawls, rested Alice's letter and the cashier's check. Her words echoed in me sharp and steady, "Live while you can." The cab rolled through empty streets, the glow of traffic lights reflecting off wet pavement. Houses blurred past tidy porches lit with lanterns, families asleep inside. I thought of all the nights I had tucked Ethan in, smoothing his blanket, whispering to him that he was safe, that he was loved. And now the same boy had sat at his kitchen table while his wife measured my years like coins in a jar. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them back. This was not the time for grief. I had to stay clear-headed. I had to keep moving. The driver's radio played faintly some old country ballad about leaving home. The words drifted into my ears as if mocking me. I stared out the window, my breath fogging the glass, and whispered so softly only I could hear, "You wanted my inheritance, Ethan. But I'll use it to keep my dignity. You will not take that from me." The driver glanced back at me once, perhaps wondering if I'd spoken to him, but I shook my head. He turned his eyes back to the road. Street lamps flashed rhythmically as we passed through the quiet town. Each mile put more distance between me and that house, but it didn't erase the sting of betrayal. I shifted the suitcase closer to my side, resting my hand on top of it like a shield. The road stretched on, and with every turn of the wheels, I told myself I was leaving. Not just the house, but the illusion that I still had a place there. And though my heart ached, resolve had settled deep in my bones. I would not let them write the last chapter of my life. The bus pulled into the Rehoboth Beach station just after dawn, the air damp with salt, and the faint cries of gulls circling overhead. I stepped down carefully, clutching the handle of my suitcase, my knees stiff from the long ride. On the curb, a familiar figure waved with both arms, her gray hair pinned into a messy bun, her linen jacket wrinkled from wear. "Maggie," Lynette called, hurrying toward me with surprising speed for 75. She wrapped me in a hug that smelled of lavender soap and coffee. "You look exhausted. Come on, my car's right here." Her sedan was old, the kind that rattled when it started, but I had never been so glad to see a beat-up Ford in my life. I slid into the passenger seat, clutching the suitcase to my lap. Lynette glanced at it but didn't ask. She knew me well enough not to. On the drive through town, the ocean glimmered between rows of beach houses. The boardwalk shops were still shuttered, the streets quiet except for a jogger or two. I rolled down the window an inch and let the sea air fill my lungs. It smelled like freedom. By the time we reached Lynette's cottage, Susan and Edie were already waiting inside. Susan, once a painter, still wore bright scarves and dangly earrings even in her 80s. Edie, a retired school counselor, sat with her arms folded, her sharp eyes scanning me as though I were a student hiding trouble. I set my suitcase by the door and collapsed into a chair. Lynette poured me tea before I could ask, sliding the mug into my hands. I sipped slowly, the warmth easing some of the stiffness in my chest. "What happened?" Edie asked finally. The words spilled out before I could stop them. Alice's inheritance, the overheard conversations, the late-night phone calls, Vanessa's cold calculations, Ethan's silence. By the end, Susan's hand was pressed to her mouth, and Lynette's eyes shone with angry tears. "That woman," Susan muttered. I always knew she was trouble. And Edie pressed her tone softer. I shook my head. He didn't fight her. Not once. He was willing to let her decide my fate. My throat tightened. I don't know if I can ever forgive that. Lynette reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Then don't. You don't owe them forgiveness. You owe yourself safety. We sat in silence for a moment, the sound of gulls faint outside. Then Susan leaned forward, her bracelets jingling. I have a friend who runs Seaside Haven. It's a new residence near the beach, private secure. Nothing like Golden Pines. They take pride in giving people independence. Seaside Haven. I repeated the name, tasting strange but promising on my tongue. They have on-site medical staff, locked security single apartments with ocean views, Susan explained eagerly. It's not cheap, but it's safe. And Maggie, after what you've been through, you deserve that. Edie nodded firmly. Better to spend the money on yourself than let it become bait for those two. The thought settled over me, heavy and tempting. I had been so used to shrinking my life into what was affordable, what was expected. But Alice's money had changed the equation. Perhaps this was what she meant in her letter. Freedom. That afternoon, Susan drove us out to see it. Seaside Haven stood 3 stories tall, pale stone gleaming under the sun, surrounded by manicured gardens. The sound of waves carried over the grounds. Inside the lobby smelled of fresh flowers, not bleach. A young receptionist greeted us by name, her smile genuine, not rehearsed. She gave us a tour, a library with floor-to-ceiling windows, a fitness room overlooking the ocean, a dining hall where a chef spoke proudly about his menu. But it was the apartment that stilled me. A modest 1-bedroom with a large window facing the sea, a private kitchenette, a bathroom with rails for my knees. It felt not like a facility, but a home. I walked to the window, pressing my palm against the glass. The ocean stretched wide and endless gulls wheeling overhead. My heart beat faster. For the first time in years, I could picture myself living somewhere without shame, without being managed, without being reduced to grandma on a clipboard. Back in the office, I signed papers with a hand steadier than I expected, 1 year paid in advance. A new bank account opened in my name alone, half the inheritance deposited, the rest split between a safety deposit box and cash reserves. I left nothing vulnerable. When the last form was tucked away, the director extended her hand. Welcome to Seaside Haven, Mrs. Collins. You'll be safe here. Safe. The words settled deep in me like a balm. For the first time since I'd stepped into Ethan's house, I felt my lungs expand fully. That night back at Lynette's cottage, I sat on her porch with the women who had stood by me. Susan with her bright scarves, Edie with her sharp gaze, Lynette with her quiet strength. The ocean roared faintly in the distance, steady as my own heartbeat. I thought of Ethan and Vanessa, of the life I'd just walked away from. And I thought of Alice's letter, her words echoing like a promise. Live while you can. I leaned back in my chair, letting the salt air wash over me, and realized I had finally taken the first step toward doing just that. The cafe on Market Street was already buzzing when I walked in, the smell of roasted beans and fresh pastries wrapping around me. It was the kind of place where college kids bent over laptops and business people hunched over phone calls, noisy enough to drown out anything personal, yet public enough to keep a meeting safe. That was why I chose it. I spotted a booth in the corner and slid into it, folder in hand, the papers I had carefully prepared tucked inside. A few minutes later, Edie and Lynette walked in and took a small table a few feet away. They pretended to flip through menus, but I could feel their watchful eyes on me. The bell over the cafe door jingled, and then Ethan stepped in. My heart tightened. He looked nothing like the polished man who used to breeze into Golden Pines on weekends, box of chocolates in hand. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and a shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on me, then hurried over with an almost desperate smile. "Mom," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. He reached across the table as if to take my hands, but I kept them folded firmly on the folder. His fingers hesitated in midair before retreating. You look tired, I said, keeping my voice even. I haven't been sleeping, he admitted, rubbing at his temple. It's been hell, Mom. You disappearing like that. I thought something happened to you. Vanessa. She thought you were sick. I've been worried out of my mind. I studied him quietly, waiting for the truth that I knew would come next. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. We're in trouble. The bank is breathing down our necks, the credit cards are maxed out, and the HOA is threatening legal action. I don't know what else to do. Please, if you have something saved, anything, you could help us get back on our feet. I lifted my chin. I heard everything, Ethan. He blinked. What do you mean, that night in your house? You and Vanessa, the power of attorney. The Medicaid facility, the way she measured my life like it was an expiration date. My voice stayed calm, but each word landed heavy. You wanted my inheritance, Ethan. My sister's last gift to me, and you didn't stop her. You agreed. His face drained of color. He shook his head, stammering. No, it wasn't like that. Vanessa, she gets carried away. She says things when she's upset. I didn't mean it, Mom. You know me. I'd never hurt you. I felt the heat of tears rising, but forced them back. You didn't have to lift a hand to hurt me. You just had to stay silent. And you did. He swallowed hard, looking around as if the walls were closing in. I didn't know what to say. She was pushing me, and I thought if I just agreed it would calm her down. I wasn't serious. Serious enough to let her plan my life. He dropped his eyes to the table. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the hiss of the espresso machine and the murmur of conversations around us. Finally, he whispered, I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know how we got here. Things just spiraled. Vanessa spends and I try to keep up, and before I knew it, we were drowning. But you could help. Just a loan. Enough to get us through this. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. His eyes flickered with something like hope. I set it on the table deliberately, my hand resting on top. This is everything I have organized, I said. My accounts, my lawyer's contact, my residency contract with Seaside Haven, all in my name. You won't touch a cent of it. His head snapped up, eyes wide. Mom, I held up my hand. No. Listen, I worked my whole life for what little I had. Alice gave me this inheritance because she knew I deserved freedom, not because she wanted me to bail you out of your debts. I will not sign over power of attorney. I will not move into some state-run facility so you can live beyond your means. This money will protect me. Not you. Not Vanessa. Me. The cafe noises seemed to dull, like the room had shrunk around just the two of us. His lips parted, but no words came. I leaned closer, my voice low but unshakable. I raised you alone when your father died. I denied myself new clothes trips, dinners, just so you could have what you needed. I gave you everything. And now when it's my turn to need peace, you'd let your wife treat me like a burden to be managed. That ends here. His eyes brimmed, though I couldn't tell if it was shame or frustration. Mom, please, don't cut me off. I can change. I'll make this right. You'll have to do that without my money, I said, pulling the folder back toward me. Because for the rest of my life, Ethan, I will live on my terms, not yours. He pressed his hands flat on the table, head bowed. Around us, the cafe bustled on, indifferent to the breaking of whatever bond had tied us. I rose slowly, the folder tucked under my arm, and looked down at him one last time. Take care of yourself, I said softly. But I won't be your safety net anymore. I walked past him out into the sharp brightness of the afternoon, my knees aching, but my spine straight, the weight of the folder steady in my hands. A week after that meeting at the cafe, I drove through Ethan's neighborhood on my way back from errands. I hadn't planned to. Some force of habit pulled me there, curiosity, or maybe something darker. When I turned down the familiar street, I saw the white notice taped squarely across Ethan's front door. Big black letters announced what I had already known was coming. Notice of foreclosure. The once proud colonial stood hollow now, the lawn even more overgrown than when I had arrived that first night. Dead leaves stuck in the gutters, paint peeling from the shutters. In the driveway, a realtor's sign leaned slightly in the wind. Bright red letters proclaiming for sale. Two women stood on the sidewalk across the street, whispering behind cupped hands. A man walking his dog slowed, shaking his head as he glanced at the house. Their voices carried in the crisp air. Shame. They always acted like they were better than everyone. Guess the bills caught up. I pulled my car to the curb and lowered the window a crack. The sting of salt from the ocean breeze mixed with the sour scent of rotting grass. Vanessa's luxury SUV was gone. Later, I would hear from Lynette that she'd run off with her yoga instructor, leaving Ethan to clean up the wreckage alone. It didn't surprise me. Vanessa had always struck me as the kind of woman who left when the gloss wore thin. The HOA had slapped fines on top of the mortgage debt, and Ethan's credit cards had been frozen. He had lost his job not long after downsized, or maybe pushed out once whispers about his financial mess reached the office. I spotted him then, emerging from the house with a cardboard box in his arms. He wore sweatpants, his hair a disheveled mess, his face hollowed out. He set the box on the porch and went back in for another. Neighbors lingered nearby, pretending to be out walking or checking mail. But I could see their eyes locked on him, their quiet judgment filling the street louder than words. I stayed low in my seat, watching. He loaded the boxes into the trunk of a battered sedan I didn't recognize, probably a rental or something bought secondhand after the creditors had taken the rest. The realtor's sign rocked in the wind as he slammed the trunk shut, his shoulders sagging with defeat. Later, I would learn he had rented a small apartment on the edge of town, the kind with beige walls and carpet that never quite loses its stains, a far cry from the manicured neighborhood he'd once flaunted. His life, the image he had worked so hard to maintain, had collapsed in full view of the same people he'd once tried to impress. I sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly. My chest swelled with something complicated. Grief, anger, and yes, a deep sense of justice. Karma. The cost of greed written plain as day on the door of that house. I rolled up the window and drove on the chatter of neighbors fading behind me. As the road curved away from the cul-de-sac, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For the first time in weeks, I felt no fear of being hunted for what I carried. The house that had once felt like a trap was no longer mine to escape. It was his prison now, his lesson carved in foreclosure notices and whispered gossip. The steering wheel felt steady beneath my hands as I turned toward the coast, toward Seaside Haven, where the ocean waited, and the air smelled of freedom. At Seaside Haven, my mornings began with the sound of waves outside my window, instead of the hollow ticking of a clock in someone else's house. The ocean breeze slipped through the curtains and carried the scent of salt and possibility. I would sit with a cup of tea on my small balcony, watching gulls wheel over the water, and feel at last that my life belonged to me again. The staff treated me by name, not by age. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," the receptionist would say with a warm smile as I passed through the lobby. There were no clipboards marking me as Grandma. No one rushed me, no one ignored me. I was visible again. I joined the book club the second week I moved in. Carlos, a retired literature professor with a deep laugh, led our discussions. He brought old paperbacks filled with margin notes, and his passion made even the quietest resident speak up. Mary, who had once traveled the world as a Navy wife, leaned on her cane as she painted scenes of the sea we could almost hear between chapters. Tom, a retired chef, always brought cookies he had baked himself warm and fragrant, as if to remind us that joy could be shared one bite at a time. Afternoons were filled with small freedoms I hadn't known I'd been missing. Tea on the veranda with Lynette, who visited often. Short walks through the gardens where roses bloomed in neat rows. Some evenings, we sat by the fire in the common room listening to records from the 60s, our voices blending on familiar songs. For the first time in years, I wasn't counting minutes or bracing myself for a hurried visit from a son who didn't want to be there. It was during one of those tea afternoons that Lynette brought Susan and Edie again. We sat around a round table, sunlight spilling across our cups, when Susan leaned forward with that mischievous sparkle in her eye. "What if we went to Europe?" I laughed at first, but she didn't. "I'm serious. Paris, Rome, Barcelona. We've all talked about it for years. Why not now?" Edie raised an eyebrow, though I could see her curiosity peeking through. "At our age," she said. "Why not?" Lynette countered, tapping her spoon against the cup. "We're not getting younger, and Maggie has a reason now. A gift, really. Alice left her the chance to live, not just survive." The thought made my chest ache, but in a softer way this time. Alice's letter was folded in my nightstand drawer, her words etched into me. Live while you can. She had saved her whole life and never used it. I had been given what she never allowed herself, the chance to choose. That night I lay in bed, the ocean whispering through my window, and thought of David. We had planned to go to Italy once he retired, to walk through Florence and Venice together, to taste wine in Tuscany. He never made it that far. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine going without him, not as a betrayal, but as a way of carrying him with me. The following week, we began planning in earnest. Edie surprised us all by pulling out a guidebook she had bought years ago just in case. Mary insisted she'd teach us a few phrases in French from her time abroad. Carlos teased that he would assign us novels set in each country before we left to prepare our minds as well as our luggage. The laughter around the table was light easy, the kind that made my heart swell. Life at Seaside Haven took on a rhythm, and for once it was my rhythm. I still got calls from Ethan now and then. His voice was subdued, stripped of the confidence he used to wear like a suit. He told me about moving into a small apartment, about Vanessa leaving. I listened, but I didn't send money. I told him if he wanted to rebuild it, had to be on his own. He always ended with, "I love you, Mom," and though I answered, "I love you too." There was a quiet distance in my tone that he could not close. Trust once broken doesn't return easily. What I had now was a kind of peace I never expected to find at 74. The ocean, the friends who had stood by me when blood had failed, the safety of knowing my days were mine to shape. One afternoon, sitting on the balcony with a notebook in my lap, I wrote down a truth I wanted never to forget. Family isn't only the people you're born to, it's the ones who choose to stand beside you when you need them most. As the sun dipped low, turning the water gold, I whispered into the wind, "Thank you, Alice." Her last gift had not only saved me from a trap, it had given me back my life. If you've ever been dismissed or made to feel invisible, remember this silence can be its own kind of strength, and dignity is something no one can take from you. Share this story so that other women can find their own strength too, and know they are never as powerless as others might make them believe.